What I have been invited to speak to is a project that I'm working on, and it's kind of an ongoing conversation. A year ago at the seminary's faculty retreat, I kind of presented some initial thoughts, and that conversation has continued since then, both here at Ambrose Seminary, but I also serve on the Task Force for Future Models of Graduate Theological Education for the Association of Theological Schools. So that gives me another venue to kind of test some of these observations, ideas, perspectives that I have been weighing as I ask the question, what did theological education look like? I'm a graduate of, I'm an alum of the earlier iteration of Ambrose Seminary. It used to be known as Canadian Theological Seminary. I'm a graduate of that seminary. I graduated in 1978. But to quote Bob Dylan, the times they are a-changing. And I don't know if you know who Bob Dylan is, but he's my contemporary as well. As the times have changed, I think it's appropriate for us to ask, what should theological formation look like for such a time as this, to use the great line from the book of Esther? And if the church is indeed responding to significant changes in the environment, what implications does that have for the formation for leadership for the church for such a time as this? It's not the only way to look at change, but one of the substantive ways we look at it is to recognize the changing religious landscape, you might say. When I studied for seminary in the 1970s, I think maybe, there was a mosque in Canada, but I wouldn't have known where it was. And when I became the pastor of what is now the Emmanuel Alliance Church in Peterborough, Ontario, there was certainly no mosque in that town. And the only religious edifices or buildings in that town were all some variation of Christian. Well, the times, they are changing. I grew up in Ecuador in South America. My parents were Alliance missionaries there, Christian and Missionary Alliance missionaries. When we came home, on what was then called furlough, now called field assignment, we came to Belleville, Ontario, where my mother was from. The church, the Alliance Tabernacle, I know that's what it was called. It's a bit of a suspect ecclesiology, but not now, Gordon, just let that one go. But it was called the Alliance Tab, or the Alliance Tabernacle. That church has since moved out to the suburbs of Belleville, Ontario, and they sold that church, and it's now a Muslim mosque. It is the Islamic Center and Mosque in Little Belleville, Ontario. If you took the train out, the light rail transit from downtown Calgary out to Ambrose Seminary, I don't know if you noticed, but before the train goes underground to the last stop, the last building you see is a mosque. The times, they are a-changing. And if you go to Richmond, BC, kind of as a spiritual exercise, every so often I drive down number 5 road of Richmond, BC. It is the most multi-religious highway it's got to be in the world. Welcome to Canada, welcome to Vancouver, welcome to Richmond. But there's a Sikh temple, a Hindu temple, there's the Mennonites, the CRC, all different religions. No, some of them, that was meant to be funny. But you go down there, there's a Jewish cultural center and worship center, and it's amazing the sequence of buildings and religious expressions that are found on that street. So that we tend to think that Leslie Newbigin, who's one of the most articulate churchmen of a previous generation, a writer of what mission looks like now, that when he wrote of what the gospel in a pluralist society, we could see this coming. But in my day job, the default is not religious pluralism. In my day job, the default of the society in which I work and the negotiations I have to do externally are not to other religious traditions, but to secularism. What I face day in and day out is not religious pluralism, but the default, almost the hegemony of secularism. And I observe, I'm intrigued by what's happening in Quebec right now, interested in the pushback from the major cities, but ostensibly the Quebec legislature has said that the Quebec National Assembly, let's state this correctly, the Quebec National Assembly, though it's the National Assembly of a province, just saying, but anyways, put that out there, that this is a secular move to say that the niqab can no longer be worn in any kind of public space where a person is receiving any kind of service that is endorsed by the province or the city. It's ostensibly, and I realize there's a big debate, but ostensibly, why? Because the argument is Quebec is a secular society. That has become the default. And the question I want to ask is, what does the church, how does the church fulfill its calling, its mission, in a society that is pluralist, with, in particular, the default to secularism. Now, there's a huge debate and discussion about, is secularism a trend? That is, so David Martin, for example, in his general secularization theory, pushes back on what I'm about to describe, that Western Europe has increasingly become secular over the last century with a fundamental change, especially in Belgium, Netherlands, and the UK in the 1960s, and in France, and that Canada is becoming increasingly secular, and it's just a matter of time before our friends to the south are going to become secular. And there's no doubt that some parts of the United States are more secular than others. So Alabama, just saying, less so. California, more so. But there's a debate out there whether there's a trend and where that trend is going. But I want to suggest this evening, somewhat tentatively recognizing there's diverse perspectives, that Canada has become increasingly more secular over the last generation. And the question then becomes, how do we respond to that? And how do we form leadership for that? I'm going to suggest very quickly, four very different responses to the phenomenon of secularism, evident all around us. I mean, I think I bump into this all the time. Four sources of learning. How do we get wisdom for such a time as this? And then conclude with four essential skills for such a time as this. A 3-point sermon, 4 subpoints to each point. It's a beautiful thing. Just, hello. I mean, wow. No, I don't know. It really just came out 4. Really, it was not trying to kind of craft something. It just, there are 4. And then there are 4. Well, then there are 4. So here I am with 4, 4, 4. But at least it's easier for me to remember because, as you can see, they didn't give me a podium, so I have to work without notes. So I need mnemonic devices. Here I go.
Good job.
Four responses. The one response, I think, is to go along to get along. That is to say, let's not upset the apple cart. Let's keep religion private. And that when I'm outside of my home and outside of my church, I accept that it's fundamentally a secular society, and that as Christians, we will keep our religion private. Now, people have been doing this for years. That is, we've often talked about Sunday Christians. We used to speak about that when I was a pastor back in the 70s and 80s. We'd speak about the Sunday Christians where you couldn't tell Monday morning in the office that they were Christian believers. In a sense, they'd already privatized their faith. But now, in a sense, the church sometimes is thinking we need to hunker down and we'll be Christian in our own family systems and in our own churches. But in terms of what's happening to the society, you can't tell that we are Christian in the public sphere. A second possible response, and echoing that, but slightly different, is the response that is being pushed, you might say, the Benedictine option. That is, I used to speak of this one as the church ghettoizing, that is, the church creating its own space to live out its faith and then sending out forays into a secular world. But Paul Spilsbury heard me give a lecture on this at Regent College in the summer. He says, well, when you're in a ghetto, you didn't choose it. When you're in a monastery, you chose it. And I thought, it's a fair pushback to say it's not so much that it's a ghetto, it's that we choose, in a sense, to learn from the monastic movement to seclude ourselves from the society at large. And while we're still engaging it, we're engaging it from the safe place of the monastic community with its rhythms and its routines. But we ghettoize, and I think for me on this second point, it is significant that Ambrose University is, while we're not in the heart of the city, we are at the end of the LRT, the other end of it's the mayor's office. And I say, we're here. We're not in seclusion from the city, but we're very intentionally trying to be in the city, even if we observe certain monastic routines and practices here, such as for those of you that attend Word and Table. Some of you were there earlier this afternoon. Thirdly, there's just no avoiding this because it's almost in the news daily when it comes to Christian responses to a secular society, the response we might call as the culture wars. That is to say, there's a battle out there, and the battle is for the soul of our nation, and so far secularism is winning, but as one contemporary song that's sung in Alliance churches at least, I don't know about your churches, goes, we're going to win our nation back. Now, the first question is, did we ever have our nation? So I'm not sure what it is we're winning back. Were we ever a Christian nation? And did God ever intend for us to be a Christian nation? Or does God even intend Christian nations? But quite apart from that, the culture wars argument assumes that indeed this country and the country to the south were established on Judeo-Christian principles, And we need to get it back to that. That is that Christian values need to maintain a privileged voice within the society. And then the fourth response is the response of, many voices, but the phrase that kind of has emerged from the conversation is the phrase faithful presence or faithful engagement. The language around, for example, Jeremiah 29, that we are called to seek the peace of the city. For such a time as this, how are we called to be an instrument of grace? Part of the significance of that fourth argument is, in difference from the second, the cultural wars, is rather than being on the defensive, that we are losing a battle and we need to battle for it back, the fourth perspective even raises the possibility that this may be providential. That is, the language, for example, of Jeremiah 29, when God says through the prophet Jeremiah, through the people of Judah in exile, seek the peace of the city, and then this stunning line, to which I have taken you. That is suggesting that their presence there was not kind of an accident of history, but was actually something providential. And the question, I think, could be, is our current religious climate here in Canada something that is providential? Is perhaps even the fact that the Christian community no longer has a privileged voice, could that be providential? That is, I grew up, as I said, in Belleville. We used to pray all the time that God would send missionaries to Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia was stubborn on this and would not allow us to send missionaries there. Well, it's Saudi money that bought that building. Interestingly enough, could it be that the world has come to us? And I spoke at a missions conference in August in Hamilton. The theme song of the missions conference, I can't believe I'm going to say this out loud, but here we go. The theme song of the missions conference was, "To the regions beyond, we must go, we must go." And I couldn't sing it. But when I was a young person, that's what we sang. And when we sang "To the regions beyond," we meant basically outer Mongolia. Because we had in our heads that was as far as you could possibly go. It wasn't just Mongolia, but outer Mongolia. That was kind of that was the ultimate regions beyond that you could go. I still think sometimes that's what people think, that we need to go as far as possible in the name of Jesus, and that's kind of the highest possible calling. And the second order calling is to be a pastor. And then the third order calling is all the rest of you. Hopefully you're making enough money to support those of us that are doing, as my father used to say, the Lord's work. Well, the times, they have changed rather dramatically. Now the world has come to us. And what I want to say is how we think about global mission. When I was an MDiv student, you could specialize in intercultural studies, and the assumption was you were going to go internationally, and you were going to work cross-culturally, and you had to understand world religions. But if you did an MDiv pastoral ministry, you did not study world religions. You did not study intercultural ministry. And I want to say, the times, they have changed. I knew then that they had changed. And even when I became a pastor, I was so grateful for my MDiv intercultural studies, because I was a pastor in Little Peterborough, Ontario. Now, maybe it had to do with the fact that I was in Central Ontario and I had come from Western Ontario, and so I had culture shock. But be that as it may, I valued those skills. So where do we look for wisdom? How do we answer? Which one of these four is correct? I lean towards the last. But how do we answer the question, which one of these is correct? And I have found it helpful, and I'm commending the possibility to you as well, that there are many sources of wisdom, but four in particular that I would like to commend to you. One is that many are making the observation, Lee Beach, for example, who teaches at a seminary that will go unnamed, lest now you think you should go study there. But no, Lee Beach teaches at MacMaster Divinity College in Hamilton. He's done some really good work with his mentor and others, Walter Brueggemann and others, suggesting that indeed the exilic literature of the Old Testament provides remarkable insight for the church for such a time as this. That is, if the Christian community is a minority presence in the society, where do we go within Scripture to say, is there something in Scripture that particularly might be relevant to us for such a time as this? There's no doubt that in my seminary education, the literature of Paul was privileged. We kind of skimmed over the Gospels and we immersed ourselves in Paul. And when we went into pastoral ministry, we preached Paul. And it was later on that I discovered maybe the Gospels matter. Maybe they're actually part of their canonical center. Maybe indeed. Well, I can go on. But without doubt, we skimmed over the Old Testament prophets. There was just not enough time. I'm now spending more and more time in the Old Testament prophets, in my own study, and in my own preaching, and I'm spending more and more time in 1 Peter, which is written to the church in the diaspora, that sounds very much similar to that kind of sensibilities of what does it mean to be the church when the church is a minority presence. Another significant voice, it seems to me, is the voice of the early church, the apostolic fathers. St. Ambrose of Milan, Augustine, Irenaeus, Origen. I confess that I think in my own MDiv, it wasn't a strong feature of my MDiv. So I've tried to kind of do some homework since, and I think almost any seminary you go to is going to have its strengths and its limitations. But I want to say, it seems to me we need to be reading, if we live in a post-Christendom world, is there wisdom from the pre-Christendom world that is particularly pertinent to the church in our day? So I'm really thrilled. Right now on the Ambrose University campus, we have an Augustine's Confessions reading group. Like, this is the coolest thing. We have a great basketball team too, but we have this Augustine's, it's a very, you won't find the same people on the athletic team as in the Augustine's Confessions reading group. But I'm thrilled this is happening because I want this literature in the conversation, that Augustine's sensibilities may be particularly pertinent to the church in our day. And what do we have to learn from the pre-Christendom church? And I read a biography of Ambrose over the summer, and in reading the biography realized how there was a sense of being continually embattled. And indeed, they were aware. They were the persecuted church, and they lived with this. They had no assumption that they had a privileged voice at the table. They had to negotiate continually with the authorities, with the civic authorities. And they were aware, indeed, that as a minority presence with a pagan or heathen majority, this was the world that they needed to navigate. And it affected how they preached. It affected how they initiated people into Christian faith. So the whole rites of Christian initiation that Ambrose started, and Augustine was one of his initiates. Is that the word I want? Initiates, is that a word? Protégés, whatever. And Augustine then institutionalized the rites for Christian initiation of adults. Could we learn something from how people were initiated into faith from the early church? Third possible source of wisdom, it seems to me, is the church in Western Europe. Now this perspective suggests that indeed the church in Western Europe is experiencing secularization kind of ahead of the curve from us. So for example, 2 years ago I had lunch with James Payton. He's the pastor of First Alliance Church. His previous pastorate was in Amsterdam, an international church in Amsterdam. And he kind of, in response to one of my questions to him, he says, "Oh, Gordon, I have seen our future. I was in Amsterdam and I came here." Now that assumes that Calgary is going to look more and more like Amsterdam, and maybe it will. But indeed, I have found it really helpful to lean into such voices as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was recognizing that what was happening in Germany in the 1930s was a secularization trend. That the church, its authentic Orthodox voice, was being marginalized. How do we sustain that voice at the table? So the older voice of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for me, the more contemporary voice also of Rowan Williams, has been particularly pertinent. But even the voice I mentioned earlier, Leslie Newbegin, he was writing from the secular West, where the church was a minority presence, reading Newbegin, reading Rowan Williams, reading Jacques Ellul out of France, reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer. These have been voices that have been increasingly important to me. And then fourthly, I am leaning more and more also into voices from the church communities globally that have always been a historic minority. That is, they've never known Christendom. They've always been a minority voice. And as we are a minority voice, what might we learn from them? What might we learn from the church in Japan? They are not just learning from us, but they've actually been the persecuted church for a long time, a minority presence. What might we learn from the church in India? Where I have had primary engagement is with the church in Lebanon. And it's been it was until I came to Ambrose, I was able to go annually to the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary in Mansoureh, just outside of Beirut, and listen to their faculty as they talked about how do we form leadership for the church in Lebanon, where we are a minority presence. Well, as I listened to these four sources of learning, four particular skills have kind of percolated to the surface. And I have no doubt that there are more skills that are needed for the church in our day. But since I had four responses and four sources of wisdom, I have to have four skills so that there's symmetry to my talk. The language of seek the peace of the city emboldens me to make the following observation. I think there has been a trend in the church to say, if we build it, large building, and if we have charismatic preaching, then they will come. That is, we will be seeker sensitive and we're going to bring them in. And we're going to judge the church by its size and by the speed with which it grows. So, for example, when I was a pastor in Peterborough, Ontario, I had to fill out an annual report, and the only two things they were interested in, how many do I have compared to last year, and how fast is the church growing? So how many and how fast is it growing? The only thing they asked me. I'm still, as you can see, I'm still working out some stuff from those forms. So 1 year we had 80 people, and the next year we had 122. So we grew by staggering numbers, and I got the top fastest growing church in the district. And we were this tiny little church, but we were the fastest growing. So I thought, well, okay. But I increasingly became to realize that perhaps indeed the effectiveness of your church is not the size of it, but its impact Monday through Friday. And thus I want to suggest that perhaps one of the most crucial skills is preaching for Monday morning. That is, not preaching so much to attract people to your church, but preaching to equip and empower people for the work that they are called to do Monday through Friday, which requires that you be aware of what is the employment of these people? What are they doing Monday to Friday? Do I understand their world? And can I exegete and exposit and communicate the text of Scripture in such a way that this text is going to empower them for where they're going to be Monday through Friday? And we'll do a little pause, push the pause button on the speaker, and turn to Terry. And we've got a workshop coming up entitled
Preaching People's Jobs.
Preaching People's Jobs.
November 22nd.
To be precise. It's called product placement. That's what you just observed happened just now. Slipped it into the lecture. But when I heard Terry, I said, yes, precisely. This is the kind of thing that needs to be happening. That is, we need to be equipping preachers to think not just in terms of are these people going to come back next Sunday, but am I empowering them for the work to which they're called? And again, in my upbringing, a sign of a great preacher was many converts. And ideally, lots of them, and conversion growth was what mattered. And I grew up in Latin America with Miguel Licado, and we would have evangelistic services, and that was what really carried the day. He didn't really care at all what your job was Monday to Friday. What he cared about was whether you had decided to follow Jesus and would bring others to do the same. Well, I'm suggesting that, however important that might be, effective preaching has to be about empowering and equipping God's people from Monday to Friday. That's a particular skill. February 22nd, or whatever the date was that you just said. Secondly, November 22nd. It's nigh. It's nigh. Second skill that it seems to me is needed, and here I'm going to lean into Brueggemann and how he exegetes the prophets. Said part of their genius was lament. They knew how to not just preach lament, but liturgically lead the church in lament. Because, as he says, our only hope is to cultivate a hopeful realism. But we cannot be hopeful if we're denying the reality of the pain and suffering of our world. This really came forcefully to me a year and a half ago when I was preaching at a church in central Alberta on the Sunday after the Fort McMurray fire. I walk up to the church and I meet two families who are coming from the opposite side of the parking lot. I'm scheduled to preach there that Sunday. I greet them. They find out I'm a guest. I find out that they're guests. Lo and behold, they're from Fort McMurray. Lo and behold, they've lost their homes. Oh, like just 3 days ago, your house burnt down. Hello, I was just stunned by it. I knew this had all happened, but it didn't kind of hit me in the face until I met this family, their children, and we went into the church. And my first thought was, how will we pray with and worship with these two families who are here with their cousins and other families? They seemed kind of, they were almost joking about it. Here we are with nothing, but here we are. The whole service went through without any reference to Fort McMurray. This is 4 or 5 days before. And at first I was perplexed. What gives? Why are we not mentioning Fort McMurray? And I think they know these two families are here. Then I was angry. And then I realized the pastors actually didn't know how to lead the church in lament. They didn't know what to do with this. We had so defaulted to happy, clappy worship that the net result was the inability, in a sense, to lead the church through, to quote the spectacular language of Paul in Romans 8, the spirit who groans with sighs too deep for words. How do we groan with the church and with the world? How do we respond to Las Vegas? How do we respond to a deeply fragmented world? We cannot be an instrument of hope, Walt Brueggemann contends, unless we can be instruments of lament. And I wonder if it's a lost art, and it urgently needs to be recovered in our liturgy. And if the only songs you sing are happy, clappy songs, if we cannot sing "It is well with my soul" with that line, which I can hardly say out loud, but here goes, when sorrows like sea billows roll, the force of it. It's like the sorrow coming at you like a wave. If we cannot sing those kinds of songs, if we don't have contemporary liturgists who know how to lead us through lament, then we don't actually have true joy, a resilient joy, in the midst of a deeply fragmented world. So the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 7, I think it's verse 2. It's on the left side of the page in the inside column. If you read your Bible, I'm pretty sure it's verse 2. It's early on in chapter 7. I can find it if I need to. But he says, in all of our sorrow, our joy knows no bounds. What an intriguing line. Well, Paul, which one is it? And what it is he lives in a deeply fragmented world. He feels the deep sorrow, and yet his joy has a resilient presence within it. I think we can only foster that kind of presence in a fragmented world if we know how to lead lament. Thirdly, when I graduated from seminary, I went to a church, and I was immediately blindsided by the profound level of conflict in that church. I didn't see this coming. And my parents who were both pastors and missionaries, were kind of surprised at me. You're surprised there's conflict in the church? Yeah, it just kind of like, hello. Well, I didn't know how deep it went. Like people had committed wrongs that went back. There was these two women in our little church of 80 people who weren't talking to one another in 1978. And I found out they haven't been talking to one another since 1948. Wow. That is, the deep wrong was like, what? And I didn't know how to proceed. I had not taken any kind of skills or any kind of training or any kind of orientation to understanding conflict and knowing how to respond to conflict. In our pluralized secular world, in the lack of a universe that holds it together, conflict has always existed, but that conflict now is becoming more and more deep set. That is, I realize now that congregation was unique in the level of its conflict, but now the number of conflicted churches are many. And it seems to me one of the essential pastoral capacities is to know how to negotiate deep conflict, deep differences of opinion, wrongs that are done, and you're going to necessarily have to have a mediatorial role. That can't be the exception, it has to be increasingly the norm. This has to be one of the skills in your toolkit. And then fourthly, one last, it seems to me that this is straight out of Bethlehem, Arab Baptist Theological Seminary, outside Bethlehem, Arab Baptist Theological Seminary in Mansoureh. They say, we teach our students how to make common cause with those with whom they don't share faith or conviction. I observe what's happening in the U.S. Senate in particular, although some of that happens within the Canadian Parliament as well, but the seemingly inability to do anything of a bipartisan nature, that I can't accomplish anything with you if I don't agree with you on fundamental matters. And when you're a minority, when you're the dominant voice, who cares what the minority thinks? But if we're all a minority, then the only way we're going to get really good substantive things done for the well-being of our church and society is we learn how to make common cause with those with whom we may well differ on substantive matters. I could name more skills, but I'd offer those to say, have them in the back of your mind, saying, if I'm going to be involved in graduate theological education, these are some of the skills I think I need to learn. And I would say, on the whole, they weren't none of these four were part of my theological formation. I suggest, even if you don't have classes that say, we have a course on lament. Lucky you, you can sign up for a course on lament. No, you may not. These skills may be learned along the way in all the crises you're taking. They're not we have a course on, we have a seminar on preaching for jobs, But you get my drift. I think these are the kinds of skills that you want to be attentive to. And I feel a fair degree of confidence that that can happen here. So just one last word. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop, astute theologian, perhaps in many ways one of the most astute theologians of our generation, makes the observation that in an increasingly secular age, the greatest threat to the church is not external, but internal. And that is fear. That the greatest threat to the church is fear. So in his book, The Truths of God, he makes the observation that the church acting out of fear is not going to act effectively in the name of Christ. So the great genius, of course, of Esther for such a time as this was her capacity to have courage as a minority presence. And thus, part of pastoral ministry is, to put it kind of simply and maybe crudely, is do we know how to lower the anxiety level? Do we know how to lower the anxiety level for the people of our church? That Sunday morning worship is lowering the anxiety level. Our preaching is lowering the anxiety level. Our pastoral care is lowering the anxiety level. That's putting it negatively, but to raise the trust level. So I'll say this to you. If I show up in the back of your church on a Sunday morning and you're the preacher, and you see me walk in and you ask the question, what does Gordon need more than anything else? Well, you can be very sure of this. He needs to trust Jesus just a tad more than he did before he came in. That is my greatest need, and I suspect the greatest need of all of our people, is to trust Jesus more, so that indeed we are anxious and fearful not, but growing in our capacity to live in the peace that transcends all understanding. God be with you, each one. Enjoy this evening. If you end up becoming a student here, I look forward to getting to know you more. If you choose to go to another seminary, no. I'd love to see you more here. God bless you.
Thank you.